الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله
Hi, I'm the Reverend Craig Morrow. I'm the minister of Y East UU congregation in Portland, Oregon. And today I'm part of a group who wants to share with you some ideas about changing something that is very good already and making it even better. This little card, it's one of my favorite little small pieces of UU literature. It contains our principles, sources, and purposes statement. Now, this statement had not been formulated by the time I was in seminary. I was already out of seminary before it came into existence, and because of it, I have been able to enjoy a 40-year career in ministry. It's allowed me to make some plans, to have a framework to work with. It is a wonderful document. It is not something that I would recommend changing without giving that change very, very serious thought. You can't just throw a bunch of words in and call them a new principle. You can't just read about something that you like in a magazine and make a new source. This document was created in 1984 and 1985 by a group of people who were profoundly inspired in their vision. I think of the inspiration as being at the level, at least, of the inspiration of those who created the Bill of Rights. So that's how much I respect and revere this document. Nevertheless, about 20 years ago, I became aware that it was inadequate, that it was missing something, that it was a little bit behind the times. And that's the purpose of our presentation today, to make it clear why that's so, and also to offer our suggestions about making a change. So this is a very good thing, but it's time to make a good thing better. Our current fourth UU source statement is a masterpiece of economy. Here's how it reads. Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. What a mouthful! Judaism, Christianity, God, and love. That's a lot of weight to carry. And this statement carries it just brilliantly. Note the precision. Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. There is no suggestion that we should embrace any so-called Jewish or Christian teaching that call us to do otherwise than loving our neighbors as ourselves. Surely such teachings can be found embedded in the powers and the structures that have been associated with these traditions. And many neighbors over many centuries have suffered as a result. But just as surely, such teachings are false to anything that can be called God's love. We affirm with our universalist forebears that if there is any God to speak of, this God loves forever all. Please note how the words of this fourth source, how these words affirm teachings about the love of God and neighbor, But don't presume to tell us whether God exists or not. That's what we would expect in a UU setting, that it wouldn't tell us what we need to believe. So the words speak with great sensitivity to the feelings of people who seek religious fellowship with each other while still maintaining a strong connection to Jewish or Christian roots, or to their hard-fought humanist or even atheist positions. If we are to increase the load this statement already bears with such gentle grace, we must also allow it to get somewhat bigger. And indeed, the time has come for this very good statement to grow, and for us to grow along with it. It's time to make a good thing better. We are increasingly aware that there are not two, but three major traditions in the religious family that includes Judaism and Christianity. The third, of course, is Islam. Muslims speak of these three faith traditions as the religious family of Abraham, to remind us that all Bible heroes such as Abraham, Moses, Mary, and Jesus are heroes to Muslims as well. Islam raises the same cry for justice and peace, the same cry against idolatry and the powers and structures of evil that we hear in Jewish, Christian, and humanist teachings. The problem is that while our current source statement invites Jews and Christians to bring cherished teachings from their own traditions into Unitarian Universalist worship and discourse, it does not extend this invitation to Muslims as well. Not deliberately, not consciously, not clearly. This is remarkable, given that the term Islam draws our attention not only to a set of texts and teachings, but also to nearly 1/4 of the world's people and the third largest faith community in North America today. Our current fourth statement reminds us that to join with us on the Unitarian Universalist journey is not a matter of conversion, but is instead a process of polishing the treasures that we already carry with us from our home traditions while continuing to seek new ones on our own path. It's one of the things that I love about this little card is that it has an abrasive quality. And good religious principles, if they really are going to change you, they're going to rub you the wrong way sometimes. That's a good thing. That's how we acquire polish. There is no requirement, nor indeed any suggestion, that in order to be welcome among us, newcomers must first renounce their own religious heritage. However, the fourth statement, as presently written, appears to extend a special welcome to some members of the religious family of Abraham, but not to others. Now suppose that your own family had 3 members. Now imagine that you have received a beautiful hand-lettered invitation to participate in a great celebration, but it names only 2 of you without mentioning the third. Would you guess this omission to be a simple accident? Imagine that everything else about the invitation reflects a great deal of concern for and knowledge about you and your family. Might it not seem, at least to the one left off the list, that the third member of the family had been pointedly disinvited or excluded? Seeing how Jewish and Christian teachings have been so conscientiously included in our current statement, it may very well appear to an outsider or newcomer that Islamic teachings have been deliberately excluded from where they too belong. I am certain that this was not the intention of the good folks who composed and then refined the current source statement. It was first drafted 1983, 1984, when Islam had not yet claimed the attention of most Unitarian Universalists, except as an exhibit in the Museum of World Religions, one of several collections of spiritual artworks and beautiful sayings. Islam was not yet a matter that seemed to require the same careful sensitivity afforded to our fellow UUs who continued, and still continue, to identify strongly with Jewish and Christian teachings. This situation has changed. There are now among us many members of Muslim heritage, Many new UU ministers of Muslim heritage, and many more will be coming soon. Do we welcome them? How? And how well? That's the purpose of our discussion today and our presentation. But changes in human faithways cannot be entered into lightly, whether we are considering change in the practice of faith communities or changes in the written testaments of faith. Considering any change in the wording of such documents by addition, subtraction, or substitution will engage us at once in questions about the whole structure of faith, about its origins and its past, and about the future that is taking shape today. This will take time. It will take study. It will also, no doubt, involve creating and empowering a working group or commission to frame and phrase a new, more inclusive statement. Just working on this one single part of our source statement, the fourth one. I believe that this initiative needs to come from us, and it needs to begin now, and we need to carry it through. Documents of faith, as much as they are descriptions of the world we see, are also lenses through which we see it. Lenses. You don't usually throw away your glasses totally. Usually your new prescription is in the ballpark of your old one with some really, really important changes. A lens needs to be polished frequently. From time to time, our prescription also needs to be updated. I propose that such a time has come. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoy the other presentations that are part of this video.
I am the Reverend Dr. Joseph Brennan, an ordained priest, a consultant to the Salam Network, and a member of All Peoples Unitarian Universalist Congregation. My colleague, Reverend Greg Morrow, has just shared with you the reasons underlying his efforts of over 2 decades to have Islam included in our sources of inspiration. I want to follow up by sharing with you 2 very important historical reasons for doing that. Not many Unitarian Universalists are aware of these reasons, which constitute a very strong historical connection between their faiths and Islam. I want to talk to you first about Michael Servetus, 1511 to 1553, a Spanish physician and theologian. Many Unitarian Universalists have little awareness of his importance, of his work, and his contributions to Unitarianism. Born in Spain, when the Muslim community had significant influence on the intellectual development in Europe, Servetus was a progressive thinker, a scholar of the classical scriptural languages, and reportedly taught himself to read the Quran in Arabic. Theologically, Servetus was influenced by Islamic thought, particularly its rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus, and the doctrine of original sin. His 2 major writings on the errors of the Trinity and the restitution of Christianity incorporated citations from the Quran. For instance, in his work, De Trinitatis Erroribus, he cited Surah 4:171, which states, "Believe then in God and his apostles, and do not say God is a Trinity. Desist from this assertion for your own good. God is but one God." Unlike Christian theologians of the time, Servetus repeatedly referred to Jesus as he is mentioned in the Quran as the son of Mary. Surah 3:45 and 5:46. Following the teachings of the Quran, Servetus considered Jesus to be a prophet, but not divine, as taught by the Christian scholars of the time. Servetus was denounced by the Christian community for his refusal to withdraw his non-Trinitarian teachings and his citations of the Quran. In 1552, the Spanish Inquisition took action against Servetus, but he escaped their hands. Later, the French Inquisition declared Servetus worthy of death, but had to burn him in effigy due to his escape. In August 1553, Servetus traveled to Geneva, where he was recognized and, at John Calvin's request, was imprisoned by the city magistrates. The trial of Servetus lasted through October, at which time the Council of Geneva condemned him to death. He was burned to death at the stake on October 27, 1553. The Calvinists and the Catholics both wanted him dead, but the Calvinists got to him first. In later times, there has been a reevaluation of Servetus. For instance, Reverend Peter Morales, former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, has said, Servetus dared to use reason and evidence to counter religious hierarchy and authority. He was willing to call for tolerance and humility in religious debate. He was courageous to look outside the scriptures of his own faith tradition. He sought to cross cultural borders. Unitarian Church in Transylvania, having pointed out that Servetus had been deeply influenced by Islam and Quranic teachings, which he refused to denounce even when faced with death, I want to draw your attention to a second highly insignificant intersection between Unitarian Universalists and Muslims. Servetus's progressive anti-Trinitarian doctrine was accepted by the newly founded Unitarian Church, which was located in Transylvania, where it had been established by radical religious reformers, Giorgio Biandrada and Francis David, who were familiar with the views of Servetus. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, also known as Suleiman the Just, 1494 to 1566, Ottoman Turks became a world power and conquered much of Hungary. The area of Transylvania, where the anti-Trinitarian Unitarian Church was located, came under the jurisdiction of Sultan Suleiman. It became a safe haven because the Muslim Ottoman Turks extended their protection over the kingdom and created the condition under which Unitarianism could grow free from persecution. This was acknowledged by Reverend Justin Osterman in his sermon delivered on the 23rd of June, 2011. As Unitarians, we are the direct beneficiaries of Muslim tolerance towards other faiths. Without the protection of the Ottoman Turks, our faith might never have had the chance to establish a foothold in Europe, and our liberal religious views might never have survived to help shape contemporary culture. Even a cursory review of the thinking of Servetus shows how deeply he had been influenced by Islam. He, in turn, was a formative force in the early Unitarian Church in Transylvania, which was able to survive and thrive under Muslim rule, which granted them religious freedom. These historical facts are not known to the majority of contemporary Unitarian Universalists. Unfortunately, the events of 9/11 led to the intensifying of negative stereotypes of Islam as a barbaric religion which promoted terrorism. A study of Islam shows, however, that religious tolerance was a part of its history since the time of the Prophet Muhammad and his covenants with non-Muslims. The Quran prohibits coercion in religion. All the early Muslim caliphates and empires offered protection to non-Muslim monotheists like Jews, Christians, and Unitarians. For Muslims, so long as a person's faith was rooted in the Bible or embraced the oneness of God, it was understood as complementary to Islam. Considering Islam as a source of inspiration, I know that discussing Islam is difficult. Our first thoughts may evoke fears, paranoia, stereotypes of terrorism. So why are Unitarian Universalists being called upon to consider Islam an additional source of inspiration? The fact is that until recently, like many Unitarian Universalists, I knew little about Islam, its contributions to society, or our church's theological and historical connections with Islam. Our emphasis on the importance of reason, our constant search for truth, and the call to be all-embracing Universalists challenges us to examine, perhaps for the first time, the reality of our Islamic community. The Prophet Muhammad and his covenants. Who was the Prophet Muhammad? What did he teach about tolerance of those of differing faiths and his doctrine of justice? I would like to share with you what I have personally learned about Islam in the hope that we might all become more open to Islam and its true message, and begin to increase our dialogue with those who, like Unitarian Universalists, search for a deeper meaning of life and faith. Unlike many current stereotypes, Prophet Muhammad was a man of peace and not of war. Himself an orphan, he made a special effort to care for the widows and orphans and those in need. Upon entering the city of Mecca in 630 of the Common Era, after years of exile and persecution, he declared a state of amnesty for all those who had previously been his armed adversaries. The only property destroyed upon his return to Mecca were the pagan idols. During his life, the Prophet achieved agreements among the Arab tribes in Medina, which had been battling for a long time, as well as between them and the Jewish communities of the city. The statements of these mutual agreements were written down in a document known as the Constitution of Medina that is preserved to this day. Modern research has discovered some 100 covenants, some authored by the Prophet, others by his successors. They were intended for Muslims and non-Muslim communities alike. One such famous document is the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the monks of Mount Sinai. In it, the Prophet writes to the monastery that for all those who profess the Christian religion, there will be a covenant of protection. If anyone breaks the covenant herein proclaimed or transgresses its commands, he has broken the covenant of Allah and makes a mockery of religion. The document goes on to say, I am behind them, defending them from every enemy. There shall be no compulsion or constraint against them. Reflecting on the Prophet's words, we could say that it is this type of tolerance and acceptance that we so badly need today. The newly discovered covenants have been adopted by a new organization of Muslim scholars and leaders who pledge their lives to fulfilling the guidance they present under the title of the Covenant Initiative. These will be extended worldwide to all Muslims, Sunni, Shia, and Sufi. The leaders have declared and endorsed the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world, by which they will commit themselves to the tolerance taught by the Prophet. Those who promote violence and terrorism in the name of Islam are to be condemned for violating cardinal teachings of the Quran and the practices of the Prophet Muhammad. Why are we advocating that Islam should be included in the UUA sources of inspiration? I have pointed out two highly important historical connections between Unitarian Universalists and Islam. I would like now to offer my thoughts on why Islam should be included in the UUA sources of inspiration. Inspiration is a positive inner force that motivates us to live our lives in such a way as to enhance our own sense of self-value while promoting universal human dignity. We find inspiration through our personal beliefs, through the lives of exemplary persons, through the example of religious or spiritual leaders who, through their lives and commitment, demonstrate a model of how we ought to live our lives. Islam, its history, its leaders, its contribution to world knowledge and exploration should present our UUA membership with a rich source of inspiration that will enhance our movement to attain world peace and justice. By extending our UUA horizons to discover the true sources of Islamic inspiration, we will greatly enhance our fellowship and our understanding of the need to broaden our sources of inspiration. UUA and Islamophobia. I would like to point out that the UUA is cognizant of Islamophobia. The 2016 UUA General Assembly action of immediate witness recognized the need for the UUA membership to improve contacts with our Muslim neighbors and combat Islamophobia. In my view, the proposed eighth principle should also include Muslims among those groups listed as oppressed communities. In the end, I want to share with you that I have spent much of my life seeking to understand theological truths and how they apply toward achieving social justice. My study of Islam has led me to believe that, like Unitarian Universalism, it is fundamentally committed to the pursuit of social justice for all. This is another strong reason why I believe it should be included in our sources of inspiration. You will now be hearing a personal testimony of Dr. Dennis Neiman.
مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم. مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم.
Hello, I'm Dennis Neiman, a member of All People's Unitarian Universalist Congregation. I'm also one of the directors of the Salam Peace Network in Louisville, and also I am the Kentucky coordinator of the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. You just heard from my colleague, Dr. Joe Brennan, who related some of the historical background about Islam and Unitarian Universalists. And following his story, I'd like to give you a glimpse at my life, my lived experiences in Iran, and give you a little bit of a background on what motivated me to support this proposal. To make a good thing better, to include Islam explicitly in UU sources of inspiration. In my thinking, it is time for my fellow Unitarian Universalists to widen the circle by explicitly including Islam in our fourth source of inspiration statement, so it may reside along with Judaism and Christianity within the Abrahamic family of religions. There are numerous sources from which UUs draw inspiration. It's time to welcome a tradition that has been treated as the other for too long. Let me share how my life as a UU and the culture of Iran, where I taught and lived for 3 years, and the study of Islam have inspired me. My roots of identity were heavily influenced by my Australian mother and father, a U.S. Marine who married in Australia at the end of World War II. From a young age, I've been sensitive to the experiences of the other. In fact, most neighbors couldn't find Australia on a map, let alone say anything about it when I was growing up in rural Florida. My Jewish godparents could not attend my baptism in the Anglican Church of my mother's childhood. They were denied entry because they were Jewish. They were the other. My parents were active in the civil rights movement beginning in the 1950s, and in 1959, my father took my brother and I to Montgomery, Alabama, where we heard the young Dr. Martin Luther King speak. His topic for the sermon was procrastination. These and other events propelled me into a lifetime of justice work with the other as we joined hands in building the beloved community. I grew up in rural Forest Hills near Tampa. My parents and 5 other couples founded the UU Fellowship of Tampa that eventually grew into the UU Church of Tampa. I grew up with a searcher's heart, and after college set out to explore the world by visiting relatives in Melbourne, Australia. After traveling overland in Europe and Eastern Europe, I ran out of money, so my dream was deferred for a while, and I had to contact a professor friend of mine from college to see if he could help me get a job in Iran. He admired the culture of Iran so much that he had become a citizen. He moved his whole family to Iran in the turbulent 1970s, and they became citizens and teachers in that country. He helped me land a job at the University of Isfahan. And my first experiences in Iran were of landing in the middle of the month of Ramadan, observed by Muslims worldwide as a time of fasting during daylight hours, of prayer, reflection on the values of compassion, giving alms to the poor, and especially family togetherness. I lived in Isfahan, regarded by poets as the quintessence of Iran. They used to say, Isfahan, Nisfa Jahan. Isfahan is half the world. In my 3+ years of teaching and learning in Isfahan, I encountered not so much the words of the Quran, but the lived out lives of Iranian Muslims. Here was a land of turquoise tiled mosques inscribed with the calligraphy of Islam, a land at the time of acceptance of Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians, Armenian Christians, Baha'is, among other belief traditions. It is a land where visitors encounter an exquisite social etiquette that welcomes a stranger, no matter who they are or where they are from. One is often invited into a family home to be treated like royalty. It's a land which inspired one of UU's most beloved songs, based on a poem by Rumi, an Islamic scholar and Sufi poet. Come, come, whoever you are. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. It doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your vows 1,000 times. Come, yet again come. Now, my lived experience in Iran includes 2 brief stories. I became a walking buddy of the Anglican Bishop of Iran in the Middle East. He was born in a small town and raised in a Muslim family. He was orphaned, not unlike Muhammad. His mother died, and his father struggled to provide an education for the family. Through the outreach of Anglicans, his family was offered educational support in his hometown, and ultimately he moved to Isfahan for continuing his education. He lived and studied in the Anglican compound, met the bishop and family, and ultimately was accepted in Cambridge University in England. He returned to Isfahan as a priest and married the bishop's daughter. Secondly, another story, I lived in Isfahan during the revolution in the 70s. Just as we have experienced recently an insurrection in our own capital, I too felt the unrest in Isfahan. Now, contrary to news reports that depicted anger at America for supporting the Shah, my personal safety was assured by friends and neighbors. The Iranians I encountered distinguished me, a visitor and a teacher, from those in the U.S. government that were pursuing the country's self-interest. After the Shah was forced to leave and the Ayatollah was expected any day, it was clear I needed to leave as well. My job with an international school had ended, and I made plans to travel east to seek jobs in India and Nepal. Now, two brothers who had been befriended by my friend and I escorted me on a day-long public bus trip across Iran to the border of Pakistan. They felt that I needed additional support during these troubled times. I'm convinced that their friendship, the social etiquette of Iran, and the teachings of the Quran inspired them to offer this support. I took to heart my encounters in Iran, where I was the other, yet felt welcomed and honored to be a guest. I was not viewed as a representative of a contentious American government. I saw Muslims in a positive light. After returning home to Tampa, Florida, I was dismayed when the media attacked an esteemed professor at the University of South Florida, and he was accused and put on trial for supporting terrorists. I proposed, and the UU passed a resolution at the 2005 General Assembly. It was an action of immediate witness calling for a fair trial for Dr. Sami Al-Arian, a Palestinian activist and community leader in Tampa. He was later acquitted. Now, you may ask, how did I personally get involved with the Muslim community in Louisville? Well, I became troubled by the growing Islamophobia in our community. Since 2016, I have worked with the Salam Peace Network. Currently, I'm one of the directors. The Salam Network is a distinguished group of interfaith leaders, of scholars, activists, peace builders, that were convened to respond to the growing concerns about Muslims in our community and beyond. This Islamophobia was permeating our culture. We have met with the superintendent of schools, the chief of police, a representative of the mayor's office, and offered workshops about Islam and the commonalities between other faith traditions, especially Christianity and Judaism. In fact, our first meeting was in a local Buddhist center. We've given presentations on the contributions of Islam to world civilization, the role of women in Islam, interpretations of the Quran regarding individuals who are LGBTQ, and lived experiences of an American and a Persian American in Iran. Our members and friends have presented public workshops in a variety of religious institutions and public libraries on these topics. For those of you who are interested in building on these educational programs, you'll find links later in this program to our resources. You may ask, how did I encounter this proposal to include Islam and UU sources of inspiration? Well, I simply Googled Islam and UUs and came across this proposal that was originated by a UU Reverend Craig Morrow. His proposal was to include Islam in the UU sources. Now, more than ever, we UUs are called to widen the circle. When I sit under the deep, dark night sky facing the Big Dipper spilling its mysteries into the galaxies of the universe. This site is symbolic of the sources of inspiration available to me as a UU humanist. As I seek to build my own UU theology in our tradition, I can track to sources of wisdom from across the world's history. I'm invited to consider a variety of religions and philosophical traditions, but not explicitly Islam. Why does this matter to me, and why should this concern you and the wider association of UU congregations? Well, as I invite Muslims to attend Sunday services, to participate in workshops on interfaith understanding about the three Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as humanist teachings in the pursuit of knowledge, I would like to know that Islam is included in the sources of inspiration and not excluded by omission. I want to participate in a spirit of welcoming and active invitation to a group that has been treated as the other for centuries, yet has made so many contributions to our world civilization. I'd like to conclude by reading a poem by Sadi Shirazi, a Persian Muslim polymath composed in the 13th century that helps visualize the common constitution of humanity. Bani Adam, humankind. Human beings are members of a whole, in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted by pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. Thank you so much for your attention.
Greetings, friends. I'm Dr. Rifat Hassan, Professor Emerita of the University of Louisville, and the founder and executive director of the Salam Network, an organization of interfaith educators, writers, artists, and social justice advocates who are committed to countering Islamophobia and building a knowledge-based culture free of bigotry, hatred, and racism. Dr. Joseph Brennan and Dr. Dennis Naiman, whom you have heard, are also consultant and director, respectively, of this organization. The Salam Network is located in Louisville, Kentucky, the home of Muhammad Ali, the best-known American Muslim and a global peacemaker. Following in his footsteps, and also those of Thomas Merton, another great Kentuckian, our motto is, striving to make the beloved community whole. Since its beginning in 2016, the Salam Network has presented a number of educational programs at diverse academic, religious, and other community-based forums. Its Unitarian Universalist members facilitated its partnership with Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church, which has been renamed All Peoples Unitarian Universalist Congregation, to which I will be referring to as All Peoples. Since 2019, we have presented several programs jointly. I have personally received strong and sustained support from All Peoples in teaching Islam to Muslim women and other interested people. In the last 2 years, I have been involved in a conversation with Reverend Craig Morrow, Dr. Joseph Brennan, and Dr. Dennis Naiman regarding the inclusion of Islam in the UU sources of inspiration. Since any change in the sources of inspiration requires the assent of the leadership of the UUA, a dossier containing relevant materials was submitted to the Article 2 Study Commission in September 2020. While waiting for a positive outcome from the UUA, it was resolved that the collaborative work between the Salam Network and all peoples would continue. Friends, you have heard Reverend Craig Morrow, Dr. Joseph Brennan, and Dr. Dennis Naiman state theological, historical, and experiential reasons for advocating that Islam should be included in the Unitarian Universalist sources of inspiration. As the only Muslim participant in today's program, I would like to begin by stating, for the benefit of those who may not know it, that Muslims regard the Quran as the Word of God, transmitted through the agency of Archangel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, who lived in Arabia 570 to 632 of the Christian era. As such, Muslims regard the Quran as the highest source of authority for them. The Quran commands them to accept the earlier prophets, amongst whom Prophet Abraham is regarded as a model of faith and submission to God. He forms a critical link amongst Jews, Christians, and Muslims. A powerful testament to this is provided by the emergence of Abrahamic faiths as perhaps the most important rubric within which the discipline of interreligious dialogue has been developed since the 1970s. The Catholic scholar of Islam, Louis Massignon, has stated that the phrase Abrahamic religion, referred to as Deen-e-Ibrahimi by the Quran, denotes that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam come from one spiritual source. Though there are significant doctrinal differences in the three Abrahamic religions, their common spiritual origin implies that they form one family and have many commonalities, particularly with reference to their ethical values. In the fourth UU source of inspiration, reference is made to, quote, Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. I would like to reflect for a moment on the second part of this source, namely, loving our neighbors as ourselves, and ask you what you think love means in this commandment. Do you think it means that every time you see your neighbor, you feel warmly toward him or her? In Judaism, commandments relate to actions, not feelings. Likewise, in Christianity, for Prophet Jesus was a Jew and proclaimed that he had come to fulfill Jewish law. What is being commanded in love your neighbor as yourself has nothing to do with how you feel about or toward your neighbor. It means that regardless of how you feel about or toward your neighbor, you have to be considerate and kind to her or him in your actions. Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, commands its followers to treat their neighbor, who incidentally is not just the person living next door to you, but all human beings, as you would treat yourself and as you would have others treat you. In other words, it teaches Muslims that obedience to God cannot be separated from kindness towards one's fellow human beings. This is reiterated in many hadiths or oral traditions of Prophet Muhammad. For instance, the truly righteous are those who want for their brothers and sisters what they want for themselves. You will never enter paradise until you have faith, and you will not complete your faith until you love one another. And what actions are most excellent? To gladden the heart of human beings, to feed the hungry, to help the afflicted, to lighten the sorrow of the sorrowful, to remove the sufferings of the injured. UU sources of inspiration include ethical and spiritual insights and values from diverse religious and wisdom traditions. The fourth source makes specific reference to the commandment to treat others as one treats itself, that is central to Judaism and Christianity. I have shown that the same commandment is equally central to Islam. There is, therefore, no logical or theological reason for excluding Islam, the third Abrahamic religion, from the fourth UU source of inspiration. In looking for likely reasons for this exclusion, I am led to think of two possibilities and would like to reflect on each of them. The first possibility, mentioned by my colleague Reverend Morrow in his presentation, is that perhaps the UU sources of inspiration were written at a time when Islam was not well known in the West. However, since the sources of inspiration were incorporated by the UUA in 1984, amended in 1995 and 2018, it is difficult for me to understand how the UUA could not have known about Islam, considering the global impact of events such as the Islamic Revolution of Iran of 1979. The second possibility is that although the UUA framers of the source of inspiration knew about Islam, they did not see it as a source of inspiration in line with their other sources. Without questioning their reasons for this judgment, I would like, as a Muslim, to clarify to you why Islam is a source of inspiration to me and about 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. However, prior to doing this, I would like to draw your attention to Islamophobia, which has escalated to an unprecedented level in recent decades. The causes of Islamophobia are old and complex. Since its first appearance in Europe in the 7th century, Islam has been seen not only as the other, but as the adversary. The major reasons why Islam has been seen in oppositional terms by many Westerners is that historically it has been seen as the greatest challenge to Christianity, the dominant religion of the West. In his epic poem, Dante, the great poet of medieval Christianity, consigned Prophet Muhammad to all but the lowest circle of hell for the sin of splitting the world of Christendom. The aim of the church-sanctioned crusades in the Middle Ages was to expel Muslims from the Holy Land. Here it is apt to mention that the term crusade and holy war are interchangeable, though very often the former is wrongly associated with jihad, which is one of the pillars of Islam. Though the 800 years of Muslim rule in Spain were the golden age of Islamic and Jewish art, literature, philosophy, and other branches of knowledge, and for the most part, a time of peaceful coexistence amongst Muslim, Jews, and Christians, they are referred to as the Dark Ages in many history books still taught in the US and other Western countries. The negative imaging of Jews through the centuries in Europe fueled the anti-Semitism which led to the Holocaust. A new form of anti-Semitism aimed at Arabs, who are also Semites, and other Muslims has manifested itself in an exponential increase in violence toward them. This violence is often justified as a defense against jihad, which is defined as militant aggression by Muslims against non-Muslims. This definition is dangerously misleading. Jihad is a core Quranic concept and it means struggle. Jihad has two forms, the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is a struggle against one's own shortcomings. As stated in a well-known hadith of Prophet Muhammad, the greatest jihad is to battle for your own soul, to fight the evil within yourself. The lesser jihad is a struggle against social ills. Islam does not sanction acts of aggression and permits only defensive wars. Its self-understanding is that it is a religion of peace, which is one of the primary meanings of the term Islam. Guided by the Quranic words that God loves not aggressors, as well as by his gentle and peace-loving temperament, Prophet Muhammad did not engage in any offensive wars and always sought to resolve conflicts through peaceful negotiations. In his view, wars were not needed for the defense of Islam. His hadith, the best way to defend Islam is to practice Islam, contains a lesson for all Muslims. There is much historical evidence to show that Prophet Muhammad was extremely mindful of the rights of minorities. In one of his proclamations to Muslims, he warned them, quote, "Beware, whoever is cruel or harsh to a non-Muslim minority, curtailing their rights, overburdening them, or stealing from them, I will complain to God about that person on the day of judgment." His manifesto to the monks of St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, 626 of the Common Era, and his pact with the Christians of Najran, 631 of the Common Era, as well as the recently discovered covenants of Prophet Muhammad with the Christian world, to which Dr. Joseph Brennan referred in his presentation, clearly demonstrate that his attitude towards Christians and other communities living under Muslim rule was of respect, responsibility, and magnanimity. It has been correctly pointed out by a commentator, Muhammad treated his enemies better than we treat those who love us. The Prophet's covenants were made binding on all Muslims for all time. The Turkish Sultan Suleiman, who gave his protection to the nascent Unitarian Church in Transylvania, in the 16th century exemplifies the influence which Prophet Muhammad's covenants had on future Muslim rulers for many centuries. Many in the Western world wrongly associate acts of terrorism perpetrated by extremist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh with jihad or Islam. They refuse to acknowledge the strong denunciation of these extremist organizations and their barbaric actions by Muslim communities all over the world. Here it needs to be pointed out that increasing incidents of violence against Muslim minorities in non-Muslim countries are lending credence to the militant rhetoric of Islamic extremists who allege that the Islamic Ummah or the Muslim global community is under siege and must defend itself. Aside from projecting the image of Islam as a religion of violence spread by the sword, proponents of Islamophobia also denigrate it by propaganding false stereotypes, including the following. 1. It does not honor fundamental human rights, particularly the freedom of religion. 2. It is misogynistic. And 3. It is monolithic, exclusivist, and anti-dialogic, as well as anti-modern. I will address these fallacious assumptions as I talk to you about the ethical and spiritual aspects of Islam, which are a source of deepest inspiration to me. I will start by talking to you about fundamental human rights affirmed by the Quran. While it is not possible to list all the human rights affirmed by the Quran, which outnumber the rights mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, I would like to talk about those rights which are often highlighted by people who accuse Islam of being anti-humanistic. Right to life. The most basic of fundamental human rights is, of course, the right to life. The Quran upholds the sanctity and absolute value of every human life and points out in Surah 5, verse 32, and I quote, "This did we ordain unto the children of Israel, that if anyone slays a human being, unless it be in punishment for murder or for spreading corruption on earth, it shall be as though he had slain all humankind. Whereas if anyone saves one life, it shall be as though he has saved the lives of all humankind." Right to justice. Numerous Quranic passages have pointed out that the duty to be just and to seek justice is a moral imperative for Muslims. In Surah 5, verse 8, it tells the believers, "O you who have attained to faith, be ever steadfast in your devotion to God, bearing witness to the truth in all equity, and never let hatred of anyone lead you into the sin of deviating from justice. Be just. This is the closest to being God-conscious." Practice of social justice is one of the major themes which constantly enjoins not only adl, which is legalistic justice, but also ihsan, which is compassionate justice, which shows the Quran's sympathy for the downtrodden, oppressed, or vulnerable classes of human beings, such as women, slaves, orphans, the poor and infirm, minorities, and other socially disadvantaged individuals and groups. One of the pillars of Islam is zakat, literally meaning purifying welfare dues, which refers to money which Muslims are required to pay annually on their income as well as the value of all their possessions. Often mistranslated as charity, which is voluntary and not obligatory, zakat is sharing of one's wealth based on the belief that ultimate ownership of everything belongs to God, and that whatever we possess is a trust from God, which needs to be purified by being shared with anyone in need, ranging from the nearest of kin to the wayfarer whose name we do not know. The paramount importance of zakat, which is almost always mentioned in the Quran in conjunction with salat or prayer, is found in many passages, including the following, in which a stern warning is issued to those who observe outward piety without practicing kindness and compassion to those in need. Have you ever seen a human being who contradicts the essence of faith in God and His judgment? Then such is the one who thrusts the orphan away and feels no urge to feed the needy. Woe then unto those who pray, but their hearts and minds from the essence and message of their prayers are remote. Those who want but to be seen and praised, whereas they refuse help to others who need help. This is Surah 107, verses 1 to 7. Right to sustenance. In the context of social justice, reference must be made to economic justice. It is pointed out by the Quran that every living creature depends for its sustenance upon God and has the right to partake of what belongs to God, who is the universal creator and sustainer. This means that every human being has the right to a means of living. It also implies that those who hold economic or political power do not have the right to deprive others of the basic necessities of life by misappropriating or misusing resources which have been created by God for the benefit of humanity in general. Right to freedom. One of the commonest stereotypes of Islam is that it is authoritarian. It needs to be noted that the Quran is deeply concerned about liberating human beings from every kind of bondage. The greatest guarantee of personal freedom for a Muslim lies in the Quranic decree that no one other than God can limit human freedom, and that, I quote, judgment as to what is right and what is wrong rests with God alone. Surah 12, verse 40. In the context of authoritarianism of rulers, the Quran gives to responsible political dissent the status of a fundamental right. Even Prophet Muhammad, though the recipient of divine revelation, was required to consult other Muslims in public affairs. The Quranic proclamation in Surah 2, verse 256, there shall be no coercion in matters of faith, guarantees freedom of religion and worship. This means that non-Muslims living in Muslim territories should have the freedom to follow their own faith traditions without fear or harassment. This is also stressed in the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with followers of revealed religions. The Quran recognizes the right to religious freedom not only in the case of other believers in God, but also in the cases of non-believers in God if they are not aggressing upon Muslims. This is in Surah 6, verse 108. Right to acquire knowledge. A common stereotype of Muslims is that they are mostly illiterate. Here it needs to be stated that knowledge has been at the core of the Islamic worldview from the very beginning. Surah 96, verses 1 to 5, which Muslims believe to be the very beginning of the revelation received by the Prophet Muhammad, reads, quote, read in the name of thy sustainer, who has created human beings out of a germ cell. Read, for thy sustainer is the most bountiful, who has created humankind the use of the pen, taught the human being what he did not know. Prophet Muhammad exhorted Muslims, these are his traditions, seek knowledge from cradle to grave. His famous personal prayer was, God grant me the knowledge of the ultimate nature of things. And one of the best known of all his oral traditions is, seek knowledge even though it be in China. Next, I want to talk to you about women's rights in Islam. Islam is often seen as a misogynistic religion which discriminates against girls and women in multiple ways. As a pioneer of feminist theology in Islam, I can state on the basis of my 47 years of study and research in this area that this is not the case. Two theological assumptions on which the superstructure of men's alleged superiority to women have been erected in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are, one, that God's primary creation is man, not woman, since woman is believed to have been created from man's rib, hence is derivative and secondary ontologically. And two, that woman, not man, was the primary agent of what is customarily referred to as the fall, or man's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Hence, quote, all daughters of Eve are to be regarded with hatred, suspicion, and contempt. These theological assumptions were Christian in origin, deriving from texts in Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. However, due to the dominance of Christianity, they were incorporated in Jewish and Muslim culture. In the context of women's rights, it is important to point out that all major religions of the world, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, developed in patriarchal cultures, in which their sacred texts were almost exclusively interpreted by men. All major religions are unmistakably patriarchal. In 1974, when I started to interpret the Quran from a non-patriarchal perspective, I was the only Muslim woman in recent history who distinguished between normative Quranic teachings and patriarchal Muslim culture, which regards women as inferior and subordinate to men. My reading of the Quran clearly affirms woman-man equality in Islam. The equality of women and men in creation is mentioned in over 100 Quranic passages. The story of woman's creation from Adam's rib is not found in the Quran, which states that all human beings were made from one substance at one time. The Quran does not hold woman responsible for beguiling man to disobey God and be exiled from the Garden of Eden. Both man and woman disobeyed God by going near the tree, which was forbidden, but they acknowledged their wrongdoing and were forgiven by God. Hence, in Islam, there is no false story and no concept of original sin, according to which all human beings are born sinful due to the transgression of Adam and Eve. The Quran is very protective of the rights of women because it recognizes their state of disadvantage and vulnerability in patriarchal societies. In this context, it is important to note that there is more Quranic legislation pertaining to the maintenance of justice in the home, so that the rights of all members of the household are equally honored than on any other subject. Prophet Muhammad made a special reference to the relationship of women and men in marriage in his farewell pilgrimage sermon delivered on March 6, 632 of the Christian era, which, like the Sermon on the Mount by Prophet Jesus, has a normative significance for the believers. He said, "O people, it is true that you have certain rights with regards to your wives, but they also have rights over you. Remember that you have taken them as your wives only under God's trust and with His permission. If they abide by your right, then to them belongs the right to be fed and clothed. In kindness, do treat your wives well and be kind to them, for they are your partners and committed helpers." There are also a number of Prophet Muhammad's hadiths related to women which are well known to Muslims. Amongst these are, "A good man treats women with honor," "Paradise lies under the feet of your mother," and "The most perfect man in his faith among the believers is the one whose behavior is most excellent. The best of you are those who are best to their wives." As Muslim women are becoming better educated about their Islamic rights, they are taking a stand against cultures which discriminate against them in multiple ways. In the interest of truth, those who engage in Islam bashing on account of misogyny would be well advised to examine the history of women's oppression in Western countries, including the US. In the context of Muslim women, it is of interest to observe that amongst the small number of women who are political leaders in the world, there are 13 who are Muslim and come from Pakistan, Turkey, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Iran, Kyrgyzstan, Kosovo, Northern Cyprus, Senegal, Mali, Mauritius, Tanzania, and Singapore. In the context of what I find inspiring in Islam, there is so much that I would like to share with you, friends. But given the limitations of a short presentation, I will mention only a few Islamic teachings that are particularly relevant in contemporary interreligious considerations. In Surah 49, verse 13, the Quran states, "O humankind, behold, we have created you all out of a male and a female, and have made you into nations and tribes, so that you might come to know one another." This statement makes three important declarations. A, all human beings have a common origin. B, division of humanity into different groups is part of God's design. And C, the purpose of diversity is to promote dialogue among different groups. There are several Quranic verses which point out that diversity of religions is sanctioned by God for a positive reason. For instance, Surah 5, verse 48 states, "If God had so willed, He could have surely made you all one single community. But He willed it otherwise, in order to test you by means of what He has vouchsafed unto you. Vie then with one another in doing good works." The Quran instructs Muslims, quote, "Call thou all humankind unto thy sustainer''s path with wisdom and goodly exhortation, and argue with them in the most kindly manner." With reference to Jews and Christians, the Quran exhorts Muslims, Do not argue with the followers of earlier revelation otherwise than in a most kindly manner, and instructs them to say, O followers of earlier revelation, come to a word that is equitable between us and you. Within the ethical imperatives central to Quranic teaching, namely to enjoin the good and forbid the evil, Islam is open to cooperating with any religious perspective. The Quran makes it clear to Muslims that they are not privileged above anyone else simply on account of professing Islam. Its open-minded and non-exclusive spirit is reflected in a verse that has no parallel in any other religion. It reads, Verily, those who have attained to faith in this divine writ, as well as those who follow the Jewish faith, and the Christians, and the Sabians, all who believe in God and the last day and do righteous deeds, shall have their reward with their sustainer, and no fear need they have, and neither shall they grieve. This verse is repeated twice in the Quran. The egalitarian spirit of Islam is embodied in its core beliefs, practices, and values. In the context of today's movement against racial discrimination, it is relevant to state that racism is totally repudiated by Islam. This was stated with clarity and emphasis in Prophet Muhammad's farewell pilgrimage address, which, as stated earlier, has normative import for Muslims. He said, All humankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. A white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. Friends, my hope in talking to you today is that you will begin to see and understand why I am so inspired by a religion that I share with 1/4 of the human race. It is also my hope that you will think about what I have said with an open heart and mind and give earnest consideration to whether the wisdom and values of Islam would be a source of inspiration to Unitarian Universalists. Thank you.